Welcome to Gideon's Promise, the podcast. In the landmark 1963 decision Gideon v. Wainwright, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled every person accused of a crime in America must be provided a lawyer, regardless of their ability to pay. This podcast is about the people that uphold that promise, public defenders. These dedicated lawyers give voice to 80% of the people thrown into the system, and yet in the national discussion regarding justice reform, public defenders are largely overlooked. This show centers public defenders in that conversation. We will explore the critical role public defenders play in addressing a wide range of issues facing marginalized communities with subject matter experts, key opinion leaders, and people impacted by the American criminal legal system. Listen as a community of advocates discuss their work to strengthen public defenders and transform public defense.
During February, we celebrate Black History Month. With that comes the important task of shining light on the great accomplishments members of the Black community have achieved, despite the disadvantages our country has created for over 400 years. So Black History Month is one of my favorite months of the year, not just because we get to celebrate Black achievement, but also we get to celebrate me at the end of the month. But this episode is not about Illy, it's not about rap. It is about our guest this month, which I'm so excited. I've been dying to interview her. For this month's episode, we are so fortunate to have an incredibly accomplished guest who works closely with Gideon's Promise. Laurie James Towns has a resume that truly speaks for itself. She has held teaching positions at Morgan State University, the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and most recently, Townsend University. She has also held several leadership positions within numerous organizations. Additionally, she is the president of Expand Now, a consulting group which helps develop leadership and management skills for professionals through its interactive and educational programs. But the reason Laurie is on our show today, her most recent undertaking, Laurie was named the National Association of Public Defense first Black female executive director this past spring. However, if all of that wasn't enough, and I only read a small portion of her accomplishments, she is also Gideon's Promise first and only non-lawyer core faculty member. And I love it, Laurie, because I've been surrounded by public defenders, current and former, forever until you came as a leader of the faculty team. So Laurie has
you and Laurie may not be lawyers. You're both public defenders.
Well, right, because we designated ourselves honorary public defenders because we love them so much. But Laurie James Towns, she has worked with our defenders on wellness. She has worked with our defenders about how to interact and engage with families who are impacted by the system. Her whole focus is this whole holistic level of representation and how to get our public defenders to understand their connection to community. And so I want to give a big warm welcome to Laurie James Towns.
Yes, I second that, Laurie. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
She got to say hi to everybody, right?
Let me just say, I could not wait to be on here after listening to your other podcasts. For the guest, of course, you've had some amazing guests, but also for the back and forth between Illy and Rap. Like it's great to be in this seat with both of you during this time. Thank you for having me, though. Thank you.
So
we're grateful you joined us.
I'm sorry. So as we kick off the start or the middle of Black History Month, let's start with this question, Laurie. Why is it so important to talk about public defense in conjunction with Black History Month? And how is public defense work really racial justice work?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Illy. So, and yes, it's an honor to be here during Black History Month. I saw someone post something yesterday and it said, I think it was Ronald Simpson Bay, and he said, I am Black History Month in the present, right? And we are Black History Month in the present, because every time we have a program or we train public defenders or make a statement, we are changing history, and we're changing the impact of racism on the clients, that hopefully changing the impact on the system that our clients are impacted by, which we know to be racist, right? And so this question is so important because we know that people of color, particularly Black people, are disproportionately impacted by the criminal legal system. We also understand that there are built-in inherent biases that we're just beginning to have a full national conversation. When I say me, I mean the country, because we've always had these conversations. I always tell my white friends, you get more than 2 Black people in the room, we're going to be talking about race, whether you're there or not. And so I love that the rest of the country is having this conversation with us. But we also know that the numbers, no matter how you pull up the data, it shows the difference between not just Black people or people of color, but also poor people as well. How they're charged, when they're charged, the severity of their charges, and what the court process is like for them, you know. If you don't mind me saying, you know, I came into public defense in the death penalty world. My first case was a death penalty case. And I came in at a time when Maryland was studying the racial disparity of the death penalty and the infliction of the death penalty. And Maryland was one of the states, despite that we didn't seek death often, when we did, I believe back then, it was like 95% of the people that Maryland sought death on were Black men, right? Their victims were white. And the disparity between the victims of the case and the folks who were charged was so glaring that Maryland became a national conversation around that issue.
Wow.
Yeah. So Laurie, I appreciate Illy's introduction. I just also want to welcome you. You've been a dear friend to Gideon's Promise, and more importantly to me, a dear friend to me for a long time. And it's wonderful to have you on the show. And I echo everything Illy said. You're an extraordinary human being. You are, I was one of many people who cheered from the sidelines as you were named the first non-lawyer to lead the National Association for Public Defense, first Black woman to lead the National Association for Public Defense. I also think it is amazing that I am sitting in a conversation with 2 amazing women leading public defender organizations who are not lawyers. You also founded Expand Now, right? You decided that was important. You did that. You were the first head of social work for the Maryland Office of Public Defense, and one of the people that pulled Gideon's Promise into that partnership back in 2014. And certainly being the first of anything comes with a real sense of accomplishment and pride, but it also comes with a lot of pressure. You've put yourself in a lot of positions throughout your career that came along with a lot of pressure. And I wonder if you could talk about the ways in which you've experienced sort of pressure in your own career and how you've managed those challenges.
Yeah, so, you know, when I was thinking about this question, the trajectory of my career became very, very clear to me. And as you spelled it out just now, Rap, it became even clearer to me. And I was wondering, like, do I just like to put myself in these difficult situations? But no. Just to say, at Maryland, I was the first Black woman, or the woman of color. They did have a previous social work director, but I did go in and make some different changes. And I think part of that is because of my history. Like, part of that is because as a Black woman, I walk into every room as a Black woman, right? I make decisions based off of my experience as a Black woman, and I make my decisions based off of my experience of working with Black people and people of color and poor people, right? I also grew up as a Black girl who was poor in the projects, surrounded by violence, with a father who spent most of my life in and out of prison. And so maybe I walk into these situations more bold than scared, but I will say that, and more empowered than scared, and empowered because I believe that I realized that the voices need to be there. And I will say that how I've done this is through my support system. You know, Rap, you receive phone calls. Illy's received phone calls. Many of our friends in the public defender world have received my phone calls as I'm trying to figure out my next steps and trying to figure out what makes sense for me and what makes sense for the community. I can also say that I always try to better myself in each position, and I always try to better the place that I'm in, right? I feel a lot of pride in that, and I believe each time it just makes you feel more empowered, and each time it makes you appreciate your skill. Applying for NAPD was a challenge, and it was a challenge for, I think, many folks who were thinking about, could I lead this organization without a law degree? And it was a challenge, to be honest, for me, without having a law degree, really dealing with the gremlins and the imposter syndrome of saying, like, am I the right person? Do I really have what it takes? People really believe that I could do this. And what I realized going into the interview process is that I first had to believe in myself, And part of the belief came from the enormous preparation that I took to interview for the job. So for everybody out there listening, when you have a job, please prepare.
Please.
Please prepare. And what that preparation, you know, it's funny because I remember complaining about the preparation. I remember saying, who has time for this? Who has time to answer all these questions? Who has time to do, you know? And then every question that I answered, I was like, I'm the right person for this job. Question number 25, I'm the right person for this job. Question number 33, I'm the right person for this job. And so what started off being a moment of agitation for me ended up being a hallelujah moment for me. It ended up being a revelation for me. And so the work paid off.
I love that, Laurie. It would not have taken me 25 or 33 questions to believe you were the right person for the job, but I'm glad you finally realized.
That's why they removed you from the interview process, right? She would have said, my name is Laurie James Towns. And
hired.
You're hired.
So Laurie, you're a licensed social worker. You've held many different positions in your career. You are stretched really thin. You have a lot of demands. People want you to do all sorts of things. You give a lot of time to Gideon's Promise. You give a lot of time to our community, our family, our public defenders. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why this community of public defenders is so important to you. Why do you choose to invest so much time in Gideon's Promise?
First, I want to say that I want to invest more time into Gideon's Promise, right? Thank you for that. But you already know how I feel. I feel like I haven't invested a lot of time recently, and I want to do more. And the reason that I want to do more is because I believe in the values and the purpose of Gideon's Promise. The first time I came to Gideon's Promise, I was sold. You know, I was like, this is it. This is it. I had the pleasure, though, of being involved in or the fortune of being involved in Jonathan Gradessa's program many years ago, and may Jonathan rest in peace. And many of you know, love, and respect Jonathan, and we miss him in the public defender world greatly. And Jonathan also included theater folks into his program. And to me, that made all the difference in the world. And also the process made the difference in the world, meaning taking time in the small groups. That was the first time I ever saw anything like that. So 15 years later, when I come to Gideon's Promise and I see it even on a different level and elevated in a different way, and I see us really engaging with meeting folks where they are when they come to the training and getting them to share their stories as a social worker, there's not very many social workers who would not be attracted to people telling their stories, by the way. So the first day when you get us around in a circle and we start telling our stories, I'm like, this is social work home. This is like social work heaven right here. So I know that to be the unlocking, of humanity. right? And the letting down your guard to meet your clients where they are. And so from that moment on, I believed in Gideon's promise, and I believed in the way in which you train and support. And the support piece, the mentorship part of Gideon's promise is very important, because once they go back to their offices, they need that support. I mean, to watch kids pull up to Gideon's promise with their cars and their dogs in their cars and every piece of clothing that they own to be a part of this 2-week boot camp. I mean, really, you really have to respect, not only the program, but the devotion and the willingness that people have to want to come and give their 2 weeks to be better public defenders, and then keep coming back for 3 years, which again is a model like no other. And so we get to see them grow, we get to see their struggles, we get to hug them when they hurt, we get to celebrate them when they have wins. And so that's why I'm so committed to Gideon's promise. And I hope that answered your question, because I could say a lot more.
It did, and it took me to my next question about, you mentioned like when we do our introduction. So for those who have not been to a Gideon's Promise program, everyone introduces themselves and they tell why they do this work. Why are they part of this community? And you talked about social work heaven, right? Social worker heaven. Can you talk a little bit about how can social workers and public defenders use each other's skills more effectively to provide the best outcome for clients? Because it seems, based on what you were saying, they have a lot, public defenders and social workers that have a lot of similarities, have a lot in common, but how can they work collectively to help their clients?
Sure. So I think, social workers are trained in the ecological or ecological model, right? We're trained in this. Our tool for assessment is called the biopsychosocial, for those of you who don't know. And for those of you who don't know that term, you may have heard social histories, right? That's you learn that as a freshman in social work school. You start putting those puzzles together and you start putting the pieces of people's lives together in that way. And public defenders have to understand those pieces, right? They have to understand the pieces of the puzzle if they're going to represent the whole person, but they're not trained in that. And social workers aren't trained to give briefs or to write briefs or opinions. And so we have to bring those two worlds together so that we are able to fully represent our clients, that we are able to fully get their stories, and not just their stories, or their lived experiences, as we're starting to say, instead of stories, their lived experiences, but the impact of those lived experiences, right? So it's not just enough to say that your client grew up with in a house that was abusive. What's the impact of that? Many of us grew up in homes where there was abuse or domestic or partner violence, right? I grew up, like, as I said earlier, with a father who was in jail, a father who was violent, witnessed domestic violence. So what makes me different? And so that has been always the one thing that I've worked with my students on when I was at the Maryland Office of Public Defender, is what makes your client different than any other person on earth, including you, including his brother, including his sister. So since social workers are trained in that, then attorneys can lean on them for that. And the attorneys can then educate the social workers on what is it, what part of this journey, how could it be received in the court, right? How would a jury respond to that? Or who needs to hear that? Or what evidence can we put in? Or what can't we put in? And so I think the way that they work together, Illy, to answer your question directly, is as a team. Right? They have to be seen as equal footing. There can't be a hierarchy or a culture of hierarchy in public defender offices or in defense teams where one voice is more important than not the other. We all know that forensic social workers in the defense field are taught that the attorneys are the leaders of the case, right? And so that's very clear, but in terms of working together, that teamwork is imperative.
Yeah, so Laurie, thanks so much for that. I mean, I think you have certainly been a leader in sort of this movement to help model public defender offices appreciate the importance of having social work staff and strong non-lawyer professionals involved in the in the partnership. And there are certainly model public defender offices in America. There are many public defender offices where every law school graduate wants to go to be a public defender. There are offices that have no trouble recruiting young, idealistic public defenders. They tend to be the better resourced offices. They have great training programs, great leadership. And thanks in large part to your efforts, quite frankly, Maryland is on that list. Illy and I were talking to Paul DeWolf the other day, and he was talking about how just over the last few years, really now Maryland is attracting those third-year law students who want to go to the model public defender offices. But obviously there are many other places where public defenders face incredible challenges, crushing caseloads, lack of resources, a criminal justice culture that is really hostile to client-centered advocacy. And there are marginalized communities in these places that really need good public defender offices. So my question is, how can we get the most passionate future public defenders to look beyond those offices that have historically been the places that every young public defender wants to join, and instead to consider coming to places that are more challenging, but where they really are desperately needed, where people will not get the representation they deserve if we don't build a culture, a community in some of these places? How do we attract young lawyers to these places, Laurie?
So I think that we have to look at what young people are saying about what they want to do, right? Many of our young folks, whether they are attorneys or social workers or even investigators, want to be movement builders, right? We talk about our triad of motivation. They want to change the world, right? And they may want to do it one person at a time, but they may also want to do it within the community. They want to have a voice. You know, when George Floyd was murdered and people took to the streets, public defenders wanted to take to the streets. And the public defenders who could not, for whatever reason in their offices, were told, don't do it. Many of them did it anyway. And many of them left if they couldn't and went somewhere else where they could. And so that's one phenomenon I think we really need to look at. I think that as we work with, let's say, rural communities, which NAPD tries to do, we have a monthly meeting with rural public defenders because their struggles are like no other, to be honest. And you guys know from doing your work in the South and rural communities, their work and their struggles and their lack of resources and their infrastructure. And maybe they have two judges. So if you piss off that one judge, oh gosh, what does that mean, right? The research shows that that's part of the problem in the race in the system in terms of race. Like poor people are less likely to get effective representation because attorneys are afraid to make the arguments around race and around bias because they're afraid that their clients are going to be hurt. So it's easy for us to come back and say, do your all, go in there fighting, guns blazing, do everything you need to do when they have one judge that they argue in front of, and they may be one of 3 public defenders in their county. Right. And so I believe we have to be more aware of what's important to the public defenders that we're trying to attract. For example, what might be available in the community outside the office, right? I would love to see a world where in our applications, we're asking people what are their hobbies. Because if you find that there's a public defender that you really love, right? That you really are hoping to come to your office and they like theater or they like roller skating, then that is going to be a part of your pitch and a part of your offer, right? You should be sending them pictures of the local skate park. You should be sending them pictures of the local dog park and the local theater program, or saying, hey, here's the person who leads the theater program. You might want to connect with them while you're making your decision. My first forensic psychology student, Rapid Illy, I courted him. We always laughed that I'd say, Joshua, I courted you, right? Because I wanted to have a relationship with Towson University, which is why they ended up courting me to come teach there. because I wanted to have this track of forensic psychology students to come to the Office of Public Defender. I didn't just want them going to the prisons. I wanted them to come work with us. And so everything that Joshua said he was interested in, I was like, oh, let me tell you how we could do this. Oh, I want to do a study. Let me tell you that we'll support you to do your study, which we did, which I did. I helped him to support his study. And so I think we need to be more creative in that way. When universities and medical schools or whatever, when they vet their staff, we did this with the University of Maryland. Not many people want to like come run into Baltimore, right? The School of Social Work is downtown in Baltimore. So we showed the deans why Baltimore is great, right? The theater part, the dish, you know, all the things that the only place that people know about Baltimore is The Wire. When you go places, they're like, oh, was The Wire real? I'm like, in some places it is. But I think for public defense, why can't we adopt that sort of those recruiting techniques, right? To be more creative for the students and the law students or the new grads or the exciting talent. Why can't we be more creative around that? And also taking public defense to the street. I think is something else we should think about, right? So we have a homeless shelter that we collaborate with, because let's face it, some of these outlying districts don't have schools of social work. They don't have social work money to bring in social work or investigators or all of these things. So what other sort of unlikely allies can your offices connect with to attract these movement builder lawyers that may not be so excited? I had a conversation about, and I'll close here, but this is an exciting question for me, right? I feel very passionate. You probably didn't notice.
No, I see. Look, keep going, because you're giving all these suggestions to our listeners, our community-based organizations, and our public defender offices, new and current. So keep going, Laurie. I love it.
Yeah, this is something I've been, let me tell you the reason I become passionate about it, from listening to the public defenders that now I get to work with as a national organization that I didn't have access to before. So, and just thinking about like who could be our unlikely allies that we could connect our members with. So I had a conversation with a head of an office in a very rural part of the western part of the country. And I said, do you know the Black fraternities and sororities? And he said, no. And so I gave him a whole education on the Panhandle Council. I sent him a link to all 8 or 9, Black fraternities and sororities. And I said, so when you look at their resume, if you see any of these things listed, you may say, oh, we have a local chapter, right? Or you might want to be involved there, and reach out to those things, those folks. And so I think that is important. Rapp mentioned in an article, I believe, and then I wrote it in my book chapter, I quoted Rapp, where he said that public defenders are civil rights activists, right? And so I believe that not only are the public defenders civil rights activists, but everybody connected to them as civil rights activists. And so that is a piece that a lot of our folks want to do. And so explain to them how they could be civil rights activists. And then one last thing, offices should highlight why their place is so important, right? So why is it important to have the best talent in this small town, right? Like when Brian Stevenson talks about a place where lynching happened is not just a place where the lynching happened, right? That the soil where the lynching happened matters. And so the place where our offices are matters. And if we can connect the offices where they sit and tell people why them being civil rights activists, public defenders matters, then we hook them, right? We hook them. But it also means our leaders have to shift their mindset to understand that we're civil rights activists, right? And to understand that these are the things that people want to fight for. So I guess in the closing, to tell people how they can make a difference in your office, because nobody wants to come to an office where they don't want to make a difference, right? So stop talking to people about caseloads, right?
Yeah.
Stop talking to them about caseloads. Stop talking to them about, you come here, you'll be able to litigate. No, if you come here, you'll be able to make a change. You'll be able to make a difference. And that's what really I think people want to hear.
Yeah, that's such a thought-provoking answer. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I really appreciate that. Lots of good food for thought. You know, you've talked about this work being civil rights work. This is Black History Month. We acknowledged that two leaders of national public defender organizations, Gideon's Promise and the National Association for Public Defense, are Black women. It's also true that NACDL has a Black woman leading it, Lisa Wayne, NLADA, April Fraser Kamara,
Yeah.
BPDA, Black Public Defender Association, led by our dear friend Heather Pinckney. And so, you know, to me, you all are doing the most important work. I really believe that. And I think one thing that troubles me, and I say this all the time, is that I feel like not everyone gets that. I feel like when we're talking about criminal justice reform, when we're talking about criminal legal reform, when we're just talking about justice, period, reformers and funders lift up prosecutors, they lift up judges, but so often they overlook public defenders. They overlook the work that all of these amazing women I just mentioned are doing. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that is such a fatal omission if we truly care about transformative justice, ignoring public defenders.
It's pretty key that I think it all reverts back to diversity, and not diversity just in terms of that all the organizations you just listed are Black women, but that as Black women and as Black women from all different walks of life. I mean, even in the folks that you just named, right? All five of us come from totally different somewhat backgrounds. And so to have diversity in the room when you're making decisions, so to have a public defender in the room when you're making decisions, to have a woman, to have someone who goes through life with a disability in the room when you make decisions, we know that the best things that are created, that sustain, are created by people who come together, who bring diversity to the table, right? And again, collective diversity, different, again, all different types of diversity. And so aside from the obvious of having public defenders who have a mindset of being client-centered and working with those disproportionately impacted, the other way to look at it is public defenders brings a puzzle of diversity to the table, a mindset and experience to the table, that when people are making decisions, their voice just needs to be heard.
So, and I appreciate, Laurie, that you talked about, it's not just the surface diversity, is what I've been saying, it's also the experience. And I want to go back to a term you use that, we talk about narrative, we talk about language and the importance of language. And you mentioned, moving away from clients' stories to their lived experience, right?
Yeah.
Being able to tell. So in the past, you've taught our public defenders to tell the stories or to tell the lived experiences of their clients better to ensure they receive the best outcome in the court system. Why do you think being able to tell about someone's experience or someone's story is so crucial when it comes to sentencing?
Oh, good question. So for sentencing, you need people to understand and have a understanding of our clients' lived experiences, right? We want to be able to not share something that seems like an excuse. We want to be able to share something that, as I always say, touches people's hearts, right? It makes them think. It makes them put themselves in that person's shoes, right? A great storyteller you will transpose yourself into the story as you're listening to it or as you're reading it, right? I think the other thing that we do is we're able to then tell the difference from client to client. And one of the things that I value in the work that we do at Gideon's Promise and NAPD is to teach around the specific narratives for our clients, right? And the impact of those things. Again, going back to what I said earlier, it's not just about growing up poor, it's about what poor looked like for that client. Right, and really telling that story. One of the things that Jonathan Cordes taught us was the 5 senses, that when you tell a story, you want to touch all 5 senses. And so I think that's what's powerful about making sure that we bring the narrative into the courtroom.
So Laurie, earlier in our conversation, I love this phrase. You said maybe you're more bold than scared. And I think we recognize when we are working with public defenders that that working in these systems, like you're going to be scared. I mean, you're going to witness some terrifying things, and you've got to be bold. But doing this work, no matter how bold you are, it is really challenging, and it is really difficult to sustain yourself. It's really hard to be next to so much injustice day in and day out, and not have it just chip away at your spirit. And I think, among the many things that make you such a valuable member of our community, one of them is that I think you have thought a lot about the importance of prioritizing mental wellness. You, folks like Jenny Andrews, folks like Dave Klaus, I mean, lots of folks do, but you've thought a lot about it. And I wonder if you could talk about how or why prioritizing mental wellness is so important for public defenders to be successful.
Thanks, Rap. I appreciate that as well. So I was pulling up some research for something and was Googling something around public defense and wellness. I can't remember, just 2 weeks ago. And something from the ABA popped up, and it was a part of a writing that I had participated in way back in 2003 or 5. And it said that if we are going to help public defenders, we must help them deal with their wellness and their mental health, right? And so that's how long this has been weighing on me. And the reason that it became important to me was because, as I mentioned, I started off doing death penalty mitigation. And I would go to death penalty conferences. I was a trainer at death penalty conferences, and I would hang out with faculty members. And I was young, I mean, I was young. Sometimes I look back and say I had no business even being there.
You still are young, Laurie. You still are.
Thank you. That's all I'm gonna say to that. Thank you. And so, with that, I would sit and I would listen, because I was in the room with Steve Brights and of the world. And so, and it was always one of them, Life in the Balance, was always during March. And so, of course, I was sitting there watching the basketball games, March Madness. But what I witnessed were a lot of people in pain who would then, at the crack of dawn, get up and go to the conference room and deliver these unbelievable presentations and have people crying and laughing and cheering and writing notes and everything. And then that night, you'd see the same thing unfold, right? Or we spent the whole dinner talking about clients or whose client was executed, or, just horrible things. And then I had a trial where a public defender or an attorney that I just adored, I saw a whole entire shift, myself and Dr. Stevenson. And I remember we sat in the hallway of the courtroom and we were like, what the hell, excuse me, every listener, but what is going on? And then she said, because she's a doctor, psychologist, and she said, I think this is secondary trauma. And so we started researching secondary trauma. And then we had a suicide in Maryland from one of our death penalty members, one of our attorneys who did death penalty, and we just finished the case. And then I started realizing that, suicide was very prevalent among criminal defense attorneys. And then I did a session. Janice and I did a session, I want to say around 2010. And every attorney in the room was crying. Like, we had to go to the bathroom and get toilet paper. And I realized this is a problem for our community that we need to talk about. And that's something that I was scared to talk about, because I thought people were going to say, of course, the social worker wants to talk about wellness and mental health. I was afraid to bring it up. But once we got bold enough to bring it up, we realized that there was a need. And so we know that this hasn't gone away. And now we know that it's even more compounded with things like the pandemic and caseloads and lack of resources and the great resignations and more cases than we can handle. And so I believe that it's important for us to be our best well self in order to be able to provide the best representation for our clients. We know that we can't pour from an empty cup. And so people need to be able to get what they need to be well. And a lot of us bring baggage into the field already. And so it's something that we need to recognize. And I believe the more we can create safe space for people to address these issues. And aren't we just excited that it's almost a part of every public defender program now?
I am. I didn't want to interrupt you, Laurie.
Yes.
But I remember when we first started this organization, right? We were focused on the lawyers. We were focused on getting them trained up and understanding client-centered practice. And as the organization evolved over time, and I think it was around the same time you joined us, and Rap mentioned Jenny Andrews and David Klaus, really figuring out how to include mental wellness, to wellness in general, into our program. It is part of the DNA of our organization because of your work and because of many others like you in the organization. And so I have noticed, I love all the organizations, they know I do, but to see what we're doing, what they're doing, and also to hear from our public defenders. This pandemic, which as we are taping, we are still in, because we are not live in the studio with you, has taken a toll, not just on the people our defenders serve, but also on our defenders themselves, because they are not only, they've always had this trauma, but they are now practicing in a space that is, for some right now who are still doing virtual court, is artificial. They are practicing in a space where not only they are living at work, is what I say. I live at work, where you're trying to take care of your family and your client at the same time. Yes. And so I appreciate what you said, and this leads me to my last question before we close out is, what advice, and you started talking about this, but what advice would you give our public defenders who are listening on how to prioritize their mental health, their mental wellness in their day-to-day work? And then what is something that those defenders can do to help their clients as well?
So I've been asked this recently as well. And I thought about it, and I don't have really a profound answer other than to stop when you need to stop. Meaning, I don't mean quit your job. I don't mean quit your job, everyone. I mean to stop and pause. I mean to make that doctor's appointment that you need to make. I mean, find a therapist, to say no if you need to say no, right? Someone asked me this, and I said, that, how do you tackle self-care? And I want to try to remember exactly what I said, because it was no sort of researchy based answer. It was something along the lines of, when I'm hungry, I eat. When I'm tired, I sleep, right? When I need to stretch, I do so. When I am overwhelmed, I step back. When I'm hurting, I say so. When I'm sad, I cry. I laugh a lot, as you guys can already tell. You already know that about me. I laugh a lot. I protect my well-being as much as I can. I say I'm sorry when I hurt, even if it's me that I'm hurting, if I'm hurting myself. And I lean on my support network, right? I lean, whether that is spiritual, whether that's my girlfriend circle, whether that's my dog who's laying right here. I'm glad you can't hear her snoring, because she is. But I talk to her a lot. I talk to Bambi a lot, because she's all I have in this house since this pandemic. So we talk a lot. And I've realized that that's okay as well. So I'm really saying, to add humor to this, to figure out what you need and figure out what works for you, right? Don't say, oh, I'm gonna start running a mile every day if you don't like running. I don't like running.
Yeah, I gave that up last year. I tried. Laurie.
Yes, Illy.
Yeah.
Do what works for you, right, Illy? So whatever your self-care plan is, it's not my self-plan, it's not yours, it's not Jenny Andrews, it's not anybody that you may hear speaking on a podcast, it's yours. Pause to find your joy. What brings you joy? Music brings me joy. So some days when I'm heavy, I will come in this office, I will blast some music, I will dance around this little floor, because that's what gets me pumped up. So do what you need for you, even if it's 5 minutes, right? Take the time and know when to hit the pause button as well.
And I have one last question. It just, when you talked about do for you, my last question is a legacy question. So you are the first, to wrap us back up for Black History Month, you are the first Black woman to lead the National Association of Public Defense. And I'm sure you won't be the last, but you're the first. So being the first gives you you get to do some things, right? My last question is, I have had the honor of presenting at NAPD's Women's Conference. And for those of you who have not attended this conference that they hold annually, and we hope we get you to Spelman live soon, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. National Association for Public Defense. Let me get the name right. My question to you is, what do you want to leave? What is your legacy after this role, whenever you decide? Because being the first allows you to do so many things. What do you want to leave? You work a lot with the rural community, rural public defense community. What do you want to leave for NAPD and all the public defenders that you work with, and Gideon's Promise as well?
Wow, I think that I would want to, leave NAPD in a space where it is more inclusive. I would want to leave it in a space where it is helping more public defenders. And of course, as we said already, public defenders means all of us, everybody who works in our offices, that they feel like that this is a place where they could come to for help. I want to leave women feeling more empowered as well. And I want to work on something that you guys started working on a long time ago as well, and be partners with all of our partner organizations in developing, increasing the level of public defender pride, right? I was making a hotel reservation and the guy said, "Hey, by the way, what do you do?" And I said, I told him what I did, and he was like, "Public defenders." He was like, "You guys are doing God's work," and I was like, "Yes, we are." I want everybody in the country to be like, public defenders are doing God's work, So I want to be a part, I know that I won't be able to do it all. I'm not doing it all, but I want to be a part of that narrative. I want to be a part of that shift.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. We have Laurie James Towns, the executive.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.
The executive director of the National Association for Public Defense. Thank you so much, Laurie, for joining us this month to celebrate Black History Month. And in true farmer fashion, I am Ilham Askia.
And I am Jonathan Wrapping
it up. In light of Black History Month, Laurie, I noticed that you put a quote in your bio, and would you mind sharing that quote with our listeners?
Absolutely. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you, by Maya Angelou.
Well, just because Laurie shared hers, I'm going to also share mine, which I love. And it's a quote by former Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. "Service is the rent you pay for a room here on this earth."
Hey, Il, before we hit that outro, why don't you tell people how to order a copy of the book in your radio voice?
In my radio voice?
Yeah, in your radio voice.
Okay. Get your copy of Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice at Amazon, IndieBound, Beacon Press, or wherever books are sold. Pre-order today, and a portion of proceeds will help us support public defenders.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
Thank you for listening to Gideon's Promise, the podcast. For more information on the topics covered and featured guests, please visit our website at gideonspromise.org. And finally, please subscribe, share, and let us know what you think.